You don't even know what music is, a violinist shot back, drawing laughter from the group. The old man, in his worn-out clothes, stopped before the piano, staring firmly at each mocking face. Trying to impress someone. Sir? Another musician sneered, while the assistant conductors scrambled to find a replacement. The entire hall vibrated with tension and contempt, never imagining the truth hidden behind that stubborn silence. Before we dive into this story, leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us what city you're watching from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The golden afternoon light streaming through the towering windows of Lincoln Center's Avery Fisher Hall cast long shadows across the polished wooden floor, where musicians in crisp black attire tuned their instruments with the practiced precision of soldiers preparing for battle. The air hummed with nervous energy, and the discordant symphony of warming violins, testing oboes, and the deep rumble of cellos finding their voice. Sarah Mitchell, the assistant conductor, checked her silver watch for the 4th time in 2 minutes. Her manicured fingers drummed against the music stand as she surveyed the orchestra members scattered across the rehearsal space. The concert was in 3 hours. 3 hours until the New York Philharmonic would perform Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 for an audience that included the mayor, several Broadway producers, and critics from every major publication in the city. "Still nothing from Marcus?" asked David Chen, the first violin, his usual confidence replaced by barely concealed panic. Sarah shook her head, her blonde bob swaying with the sharp movement. "His phone goes straight to voicemail. His agent says he was supposed to be here 2 hours ago." Marcus Whitmore, the celebrated pianist whose name graced the programs already distributed to early arriving patrons, had simply vanished. The man who had commanded standing ovations at Carnegie Hall and whose recordings topped classical music charts had become a ghost, leaving behind only an empty piano bench and the growing dread of 90 musicians who suddenly faced professional catastrophe. "We could postpone," whispered Jennifer Walsh, the principal cellist, her voice barely audible above the anxious murmur spreading through the hall. "Postpone." Sarah's green eyes flashed. "Do you know how many people are out there? The Times critic alone could destroy our reputation with a single review about our unprofessionalism." The massive Steinway concert grand piano dominated the center of the stage area like a sleeping giant, its black surface reflecting the worried faces of musicians who had spent months preparing for this moment. The ivory keys seemed to mock them with their silence, each one a reminder of the music that might never be played. Thomas Rodriguez, the principal trumpet player, wiped sweat from his brow despite the hall's perfect climate control. "Maybe we could find someone from Juilliard? A student who knows the piece?" "In 3 hours." Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Diki, you think we can just pull a miracle pianist out of thin air who can perform one of the most technically demanding concertos ever written?" The conversations grew more frantic, voices overlapping in a cacophony of suggestions and desperation. Some musicians had begun packing their instruments, their faces resigned to the inevitable cancellation announcement. Others clustered around Sarah, throwing out increasingly desperate alternatives that everyone knew were impossible. It was during this chaos of professional panic that the heavy oak door at the back of the hall creaked open with a sound that cut through the arguing voices like a blade through silk. An elderly man shuffled through the entrance, his worn canvas sneakers making soft whisking sounds against the marble floor. His clothes told the story of someone who had seen better decades. A faded gray cardigan with pills on the elbows, brown corduroy pants that had been mended in several places, and a thin white dress shirt that had yellowed slightly around the collar. His silver hair, unkempt and curling at the edges, framed a face weathered by years but illuminated by surprisingly bright blue eyes. The conversations died one by one as heads turned to stare at the intruder. The man moved with careful steps, his gnarled hands clasped behind his back, taking in the grandeur of the hall with the wonder of someone seeing it for the first time, or perhaps someone remembering it from long ago. "Excuse me," Sarah called out, her voice sharp with the stress of the moment. "This is a closed rehearsal. You'll need to leave." The old man stopped, his head turning toward her with deliberate slowness. When he spoke, his voice carried the rough texture of age, but held an underlying strength that surprised everyone who heard it. "I heard you might be needing a piano player." The silence that followed was so complete that the distant sounds of New York traffic seemed to roar through the windows. Then, like a dam breaking, the laughter began. It started with David Chen's sharp bark of disbelief, spread to Jennifer's nervous giggle, "Sariri," and soon filled the hall with the cruel sound of professional musicians confronted with what they perceived as a ridiculous suggestion. "Oh, that's rich," Thomas called out, his trumpet still held loosely in one hand. "Gramps here thinks he can play Rachmaninoff." "Did you wander in from the street?" another voice asked. "This isn't amateur hour at the community center." The old man stood perfectly still during the wave of mockery, his expression unchanging as comments flew around him like arrows that somehow missed their target. His blue eyes moved slowly across the faces before him, taking in each laugh, each dismissive gesture, each expression of casual cruelty, with the patience of someone who had weathered far worse storms. Sarah raised her hand, and the laughter gradually subsided. "Sir, I'm sorry, but we're professional musicians preparing for a major performance. This really isn't the time or place for—" "For what?" the old man asked quietly. "For music. For whatever this is," Sarah replied, gesturing vaguely at his appearance. "Security will escort you out if necessary." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah felt a strange reluctance. Something in the man's bearing, in the way he had spoken the word music with such simple reverence, gave her pause. The other musicians had already dismissed him, returning to their panicked conversations about the missing pianist, but the old man remained standing there, unmoving, like a stone in a stream. "You don't understand," he said, his voice carrying just far enough to reach Sarah's ears. "I know this. I know it better than most." "I'm sure you think you do," David interjected without looking up from his violin. "But this isn't chopsticks, old-timer. This is serious music that requires serious training." The old man's eyes found David's face, and for a moment, something flickered across his weathered features. Not anger, but something deeper, sadder. It was the look of someone who had watched the world forget something precious, something that had once been held sacred. "Music," he said softly, "doesn't care how old your clothes are." The comment hung in the air, and for just an instant, the hall fell quiet again. But the moment passed quickly, swept away by the returning tide of anxiety and professional urgency. The musicians had a crisis to solve, and a strange old man was not going to provide their solution. As discussions resumed about potential cancellation procedures and insurance claims, the old man moved closer to the piano. His steps were sure now, as if he were being drawn by something the others couldn't see. He stopped a few feet from the bench, close enough to see his reflection in the polished black surface of the instrument. His weathered hand reached out slowly, stopping just inches from the keys. The gesture was so gentle, so reverent, that Jennifer Walsh paused in her conversation to watch. There was something in the way he approached the piano that reminded her of how her grandfather had approached her grandmother's bedside in those final hospital days, with love, with history, with the weight of shared years that others could never fully understand. But the moment passed, and Jennifer returned to the practical concerns at hand. The old man was forgotten again, standing alone beside the piano, while the orchestra struggled with the growing certainty that their evening was doomed. Outside, The early autumn sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. In 3 hours, the doors would open to an expectant audience. In 3 hours, the curtain would rise on what should have been a triumphant performance. Instead, it seemed destined to become a story of failure. Of the night the New York Philharmonic disappointed the city that had supported it for generations. The empty piano bench stood as a monument to that approaching disaster, a silent witness to the price of depending on the irreplaceable. But the old man continued to stand there, patient as the shadows grew longer around him, waiting for something that the others couldn't yet see coming. His presence had been dismissed as an intrusion, a moment of unwelcome comedy in their professional tragedy. None of them realized that redemption sometimes arrives wearing the most unexpected disguises, or that the greatest music often emerges from the deepest humiliation. The story of this evening was far from over, and the old man beside the piano knew something that the rest of them had yet to learn, that in the language of music, the most powerful voice often speaks last. The news of Marcus Whitmore's continued absence spread through Lincoln Center like wildfire through dry grass. Theater staff whispered in corners, their faces grave with the implications of a canceled performance. Box office managers fielded increasingly urgent phone calls from patrons asking about delays. The Golden Foyer, where champagne reception tables stood ready with crystal glasses and white linens, felt like a ballroom prepared for a party that would never begin. Eleanor Pemberton, the Philharmonic's board chairwoman, swept through the rehearsal hall doors with the commanding presence of someone accustomed to solving problems through sheer force of will and carefully applied social pressure. Her silver hair was arranged in a perfect chignon, her navy suit pressed to military precision, and her pearl earrings caught the light as her head turned to assess the situation with laser-like efficiency. "Sarah!" she called out, her voice carrying the crisp authority of generations of New England breeding. "What exactly is our status?" Sarah Mitchell hurried toward her, clutching a sheaf of papers and looking increasingly frayed around the edges. "We've contacted every available pianist in the city. Zimmerman is performing in Boston, Liu is recording in Los Angeles, and Davidson is recovering from surgery on his left hand. There's simply no one of Marcus's caliber available." "Caliber," Eleanor repeated, the word sharp on her tongue. "And what about someone of lesser caliber? Surely the performance of a lifetime is better than no performance at all." The old man, still standing near the piano, turned slightly at these words. His blue eyes tracked Eleanor's movement across the hall, taking in her expensive clothing, her commanding posture, the way other people instinctively stepped aside to let her pass. He had seen such people before, in other halls, in other times when music had served power as much as beauty. "Mrs. Pemberton," David Chen interjected, setting down his violin with more force than necessary. "This isn't community theater. We can't just grab someone off the street and hope for the best. The Rachmaninoff second requires years of study, perfect technical control, and what alternative do you suggest, Mr. Chen?" Eleanor's voice could have frozen champagne. "That we refund $40,000 in tickets? That we disappoint the mayor, who specifically requested this piece? That we explain to the Times why the New York Philharmonic couldn't manage to present a scheduled performance?" The silence that followed was uncomfortable, heavy with the weight of professional reputations hanging in the balance. Musicians who had spent decades building their careers now faced the prospect of being remembered for the night they failed to deliver when it mattered most. Thomas Rodriguez cleared his throat nervously. "There might be someone at Manhattan School of Music. A graduate student, maybe. Someone who knows the notes, even if they don't have the polish." "Polish?" Eleanor's laugh was brittle as autumn leaves. "We're not looking for polish anymore, Mr. Rodriguez. We're looking for survival." It was then that the old man took a step forward, the sound of his worn sneakers against the floor drawing attention like a pebble dropped into a still pond. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying further than it had before, reaching every corner of the hall with surprising clarity. Eleanor turned toward him with the sharp focus of a hawk spotting prey. Her eyes took in his shabby clothes, his unkempt hair, his general appearance of someone who had wandered in from the street. "And you are someone who might be able to help," the old man replied simply. The laughter this time was harder, more desperate than before. Jennifer Walsh actually doubled over, her cello bow clattering to the floor as giggles overtook her professional composure. "Oh my God," she gasped. "He's serious. He actually thinks he can play?" "This is insane," muttered another musician. "Next, we'll have people claiming they can conduct because they wave their arms around to music in their cars." But Eleanor Pemberton was a woman who had built her fortune in real estate by recognizing opportunity in the most unlikely places. She studied the old man with the calculating gaze of someone who had learned to look beyond surface appearances when everything else was at stake. "You play piano?" she asked, her tone neutral, professional. "Yes," he answered. "What pieces do you know?" "Many," he said, "including the one you need tonight." The hall erupted in fresh waves of mockery. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Mrs. Pemberton, surely you're not considering this. This man is clearly, well, look at him. The Rachmaninoff Second is one of the most technically demanding pieces in the repertoire. It requires someone who can play it." Eleanor interrupted. "Show me another option, Sarah. Give me one name of someone who could be here in 2 hours, and I'll forget this conversation ever happened." Sarah's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Around the hall, musicians exchanged glances that mixed disbelief with growing desperation. The clock on the wall ticked toward evening with mechanical indifference, each second bringing them closer to either salvation or professional catastrophe. The old man waited through the silence with the patience of someone who had learned that truth reveals itself in its own time. His hands remained clasped behind his back, but his eyes had begun to focus on the piano with an intensity that seemed to transform his entire bearing. The instrument drew him like a magnet draws iron, and though he stood perfectly still, everyone who watched him felt the strange pull of that connection. "What's your name?" Eleanor asked suddenly. "Frank," he replied. "Frank Morrison. And where did you study music, Frank Morrison?" Frank's blue eyes met hers directly. "Here and there. Different places. Long time ago." David Chen snorted with derision. "Here and there, lady. This guy probably learned 'Mary Had a Little Lamb' at some church social and thinks that qualifies him for Lincoln Center." "Actually," Frank said quietly, "I was thinking more along the lines of Für Elise. More challenging, you understand?" The mild joke fell flat, met with rolled eyes and exasperated sighs, but Eleanor found herself studying the man more carefully. There was something in his demeanor that didn't quite match his appearance, a confidence that seemed unshakable, a stillness that suggested depths unseen. "Frank," she said, "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Can you play the Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto No. 2 well enough to perform it with professional musicians in front of a demanding New York audience?" The question hung in the air like a challenge thrown down between duelists. Every musician in the hall turned to stare at Frank, their expressions ranging from curious to contemptuous. The stakes had been clearly laid out. Not just the success of one evening's performance, but the credibility of everyone present. Frank looked around the room slowly, taking in each face, each expression of doubt and dismissal. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady as bedrock. "Yes," he said, "I can play it." "Oh, come on," Thomas exploded. "Ah, this is ridiculous. Mrs. Pemberton, with all due respect, we can't risk the reputation of the entire orchestra on some homeless guy who wandered in off the street. I'm not homeless, Frank said mildly. I have a small apartment on the Upper West Side. Third floor. Nice view of the courtyard. The specific detail, delivered with such matter-of-fact clarity, gave everyone pause. Somehow, in their minds, they had assigned him to the category of vagrant, street person, someone with no real life or history. The mention of an apartment, a specific location, a normal existence forced them to reconsider their assumptions, if only slightly. Eleanor stepped closer to Frank, close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes, the careful way he held himself, the surprising steadiness of his gaze. You understand what you're claiming. This piece has brought down professional pianists. It's destroyed careers. It's considered one of the ultimate tests of technical skill and musical interpretation. I understand, Frank replied, and you still claim you can play it. I don't claim it, Frank said quietly. I know it. Something in his tone, not boastful, not desperate, but absolutely certain, sent a strange shiver through the hall. For just a moment, the mockery faded, replaced by something that might have been the faintest whisper of possibility. But the moment passed quickly, swept away by the return of practical concerns and professional skepticism. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward again, her voice tight with controlled frustration. Mrs. Pemberton, even if, and I cannot stress enough how enormous and if this is, even if this gentleman can play the notes, there's the question of rehearsal time, of coordination with the orchestra, of stage presence, of dignity, added Jennifer Walsh. What will people think when they see— She didn't finish the sentence, but her gesture toward Frank's shabby clothes completed the thought with devastating clarity. Frank absorbed this final insult with the same quiet grace he had shown all the others. But now, something had shifted in the atmosphere around the piano. The late afternoon light streaming through the windows seemed to gather around the instrument, highlighting its majestic curves, the perfect arrangement of its keys, the way its strings waited in silent potential. Music, Frank said softly, doesn't care what you wear. It cares what you bring to it. Eleanor Pemberton found herself caught between the crushing weight of expectation and the slimmest thread of desperate hope. Around her, professional musicians who had dedicated their lives to the pursuit of musical excellence waited for her decision. Outside, an audience dressed in their finest clothes anticipated an evening of transcendent artistry. And beside the piano, a shabby old man who claimed to know one of music's greatest challenges waited with infinite patience for someone to believe him. The clock ticked on, indifferent to dreams and fears alike, carrying them all toward a moment when faith and doubt would finally meet their test. The next 30 minutes unfolded like a slow-motion catastrophe observed from a great distance. Phone calls to distant music schools yielded nothing but apologetic voicemails and suggestions to try other numbers. The Metropolitan Opera's rehearsal pianist was already committed to their evening performance. The jazz pianist at the Blue Note, suggested in desperation by someone's cousin, had never played classical music professionally and laughed openly at the suggestion. Meanwhile, Frank Morrison remained beside the Steinway like a lighthouse keeper maintaining his post during a storm. He had not moved from his position, had not repeated his offer, had not pressed his case with the increasing desperation that circumstances seemed to warrant. He simply stood there, occasionally reaching out to touch the piano's polished surface with one finger, as if testing whether it was real. Eleanor Pemberton found herself watching him more frequently as each potential solution crumbled to dust. There was something unsettling about his composure, something that didn't align with her understanding of how people behaved in crisis situations. Normal people grew agitated, offered additional credentials, became defensive when mocked. Frank Morrison did none of these things. 45 minutes, Sarah announced, her voice cracking slightly under the pressure. 45 minutes until house management needs to know whether to hold the doors or start refunding tickets. The orchestra members had begun to split into factions. Some packed their instruments with resigned acceptance of defeat. Others clustered around music stands, frantically discussing whether they could perform an abbreviated program without piano. Perhaps some Brahms symphonic movements, or a selection of shorter pieces that might fill an evening without the featured concerto. David Chen had appointed himself the voice of professional reason, moving from group to group with animated arguments about maintaining artistic integrity. "We'd rather cancel than compromise our standards," he declared repeatedly. "This is the New York Philharmonic, not some hotel lounge act." But Jennifer Walsh, perhaps because she sat closest to Frank during rehearsals, had begun to notice things about the old man that others missed. The way his eyes followed conversations about musical interpretation with obvious comprehension. The way his fingers moved almost imperceptibly when someone mentioned a particular passage of the concerto. The way he seemed to hear every note that was played, even when multiple instruments tuned simultaneously. "Mrs. Pemberton," she said quietly, approaching the board chairwoman during a brief lull in the chaos, "has anyone actually heard him play anything?" Eleanor paused in her fierce texting to various board members and looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean, everyone's arguing about whether he can play the Rachmaninoff. But has anyone asked him to demonstrate even basic piano skills? If he can't play chopsticks, we know the answer. If he can actually play something substantial..." The suggestion hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Around the hall, arguments continued about logistics and reputation and the impossibility of the situation. But neither woman took her eyes off Frank Morrison, who seemed to sense their attention and looked back at them with those remarkably clear blue eyes. "Frank," Eleanor called out, her voice cutting through the overlapping conversations like a conductor's baton, demanding attention. The hall gradually quieted as heads turned toward the exchange. Frank took a step closer, his worn sneakers whisper-soft against the floor. "Yes, ma'am. Would you be willing to play something for us? Something to demonstrate your..." Eleanor paused, choosing her words carefully. "Your familiarity with the piano." The request triggered immediate protests from multiple directions. David Chen stood up so abruptly that his violin case clattered to the floor. "This is absurd. We're going to waste precious time listening to some old man stumble through Danny Boy, or whatever he thinks passes for piano music." "What harm can it do?" Jennifer asked, her voice carrying surprising strength. "Either he can play, in which case we have a conversation worth having, or he can't, in which case we've lost 5 minutes confirming what everyone already believes." Thomas Rodriguez laughed bitterly. 5 minutes. It'll take him 5 minutes just to remember where Middle C is located. But Frank was already moving toward the piano bench with steps that seemed to gain certainty with each stride. The shabby old man who had shuffled into the hall like an unwelcome intruder now approached the instrument with something approaching reverence, his entire bearing transformed by proximity to the keys. He stopped at the bench but did not immediately sit down. Instead, he stood looking down at the keyboard with an expression that mixed joy and sorrow in equal measure. His weathered hands hovered over the keys without touching them, and for a moment, the watching musicians saw something in his posture that gave them pause. "What would you like to hear?" Frank asked, his voice surprisingly steady. "Something we know," Eleanor replied. "Something that will give us a sense of your technical ability." Frank nodded slowly. Technical ability. He seemed to taste the words, finding them both familiar and strange. "How about some Chopin? The Minute Waltz, perhaps? That should be technical enough." Several musicians exchanged glances. The Chopin Waltz in D-flat major, despite its popular nickname, was far from simple. It required precise fingerwork, clear articulation, and the kind of musical sensitivity that separated trained professionals from talented amateurs. "Oh, Chopin is fine," Eleanor said. Frank finally sat down on the bench, his movements careful and deliberate. He adjusted the seat height with the practiced motions of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times. His hands came to rest on the keys, and in that instant, something fundamental shifted in the atmosphere of the hall. The first notes that emerged from the Steinway were not the hesitant, uncertain sounds that everyone expected. Instead, the opening measures of the minute waltz flowed from Frank's fingers with crystalline clarity, each note perfectly placed, the rhythm buoyant and confident. But it was more than technical accuracy. There was poetry in his playing, a sense of joy and melancholy intertwined that transformed the familiar piece into something fresh and moving. The hall fell absolutely silent, except for the dancing notes that filled the space like light made audible. Frank's fingers moved across the keys with surprising agility, his body swaying slightly with the music in the unconscious way of someone who had long ago learned to let the melody guide his movement. As the waltz progressed through its intricate passages, the musicians began to lean forward despite themselves. The technique was flawless, better than flawless. It was effortless. But beyond the technical mastery was something more elusive and more precious. The unmistakable sound of someone who didn't just play music, but spoke it as a native language. Jennifer Walsh felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, without understanding why. David Chen's mouth had fallen slightly open, his protests dying unspoken on his lips. Thomas Rodriguez lowered his trumpet to his lap and stared at the shabby figure at the piano with growing amazement. The waltz built to its climactic passages, and Frank's playing rose to meet every challenge with ease and grace. His left hand provided a perfect counterpoint to the melody line. His use of the pedal created seamless connections between phrases, and his interpretation revealed layers of meaning in music that most people considered merely pleasant. When the final notes faded into silence, no one spoke for several seconds. The transformation had been too complete, too unexpected, for immediate reaction. The man they had dismissed as a delusional vagrant had just delivered a performance that would have been respectable in any concert hall in the world. Eleanor Pemberton was the first to find her voice. "That was," she began, then stopped, searching for words that could encompass what they had all just witnessed. "That was extraordinary," Jennifer finished for her, her voice soft with wonder. Frank turned on the bench to face them, his blue eyes bright with something that might have been satisfaction or might have been sorrow. "The Chopin was always one of my favorites," he said simply. "Light enough to lift the spirit, complex enough to challenge the mind." David Chen stood up slowly, his expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, and growing recognition. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you study? Who was your teacher?" Frank's smile was gentle, but evasive. "Does it matter? The music speaks for itself." "But you can't just—" David gestured helplessly at the piano, at Frank, at the impossible situation they found themselves confronting. People don't just walk off the street and play like that. It takes years of training, decades of practice, professional instruction. "Yes," Frank agreed quietly. "It does." The implications of this simple acknowledgement rippled through the hall like stones dropped in still water. If Frank Morrison possessed the technical skill they had just witnessed, if he could make a piano sing with such eloquence and power, then what did that say about their assumption? What did it say about the story he wasn't telling? Sarah Mitchell approached the piano slowly, her skepticism warring with the evidence of her own ears. "The Chopin was beautiful," she admitted grudgingly, "but the Rachmaninoff is an entirely different challenge. It's longer, more complex, requires coordination with a full orchestra. "Would you like me to play some of it?" Frank asked. The offer landed in the sudden silence like a gauntlet thrown down in challenge. Everyone in the hall understood that they were approaching a moment of truth that would define not just the evening's performance, but their understanding of possibility itself. Outside, the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the windows in deeper shades of gold and amber. Inside, a shabby old man sat at one of the world's finest pianos, waiting patiently for the answer to a question that could change everything. Eleanor Pemberton looked around the hall, taking in the faces of musicians who had spent their careers in pursuit of musical excellence, now confronted with something that challenged their most basic assumptions about talent, training, and the nature of artistic achievement itself. "Yes," she said finally, her voice carrying across the hushed space with quiet authority. "Yes, I think we would all very much like to hear some Rachmaninoff." Frank Morrison nodded once, turned back to the keyboard, and prepared to reveal the next chapter of a mystery that had been 30 years in the making. Frank's hands settled on the keys once more, but this time he paused before beginning, as if gathering something from deep within himself. The silence stretched long enough for people to shift in their seats, long enough for doubt to creep back into some minds, long enough for the skeptics to wonder if the Chopin had been a fluke, a single-party trick that would crumble under the weight of greater challenge. Then the opening chords of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the hall, and every person present understood immediately that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The concerto began not with the orchestra's introduction, but with the solo piano's dramatic entry that normally comes after the full ensemble establishes the piece. Frank played the famous opening theme with such power and authority that several musicians instinctively reached for their instruments, their bodies responding to music that seemed to call forth an entire orchestra from memory alone. But it was more than just the technical perfection, more than the flawless execution of one of classical music's most demanding pieces. Frank Morrison played with the deep understanding of someone who had lived inside this music for decades, who knew every phrase not just as a series of notes to be executed, but as an emotional journey to be experienced and shared. His interpretation revealed layers of meaning that most pianists spent years trying to uncover. The melancholy passages sang with genuine sorrow, the triumphant sections blazed with authentic joy, and the quiet interludes whispered with the intimacy of secrets shared between old friends. This wasn't just someone playing Rachmaninoff. This was someone who understood Rachmaninoff, who spoke the composer's language with native fluency. Jennifer Walsh found herself unconsciously bowing along with the melody line, her cello silent in her hands, but her body responding to the music with the automatic reflexes of decades of professional training. Beside her, other string players swayed slightly, their fingers moving on imaginary strings as Frank's piano called forth the ghost of their missing parts. David Chen stood transfixed, his violin forgotten, as he watched Frank's hands dance across the keyboard with impossible grace. The man's age seemed to disappear as he played, his weathered fingers moving with the precision and power of someone decades younger, yet guided by the wisdom of experience that only comes from a lifetime devoted to music. As Frank moved through the concerto's first movement, playing not just the piano part but somehow evoking the entire orchestral arrangement through his solo interpretation, Eleanor Pemberton felt a strange mixture of elation and unease. Here was the solution to their crisis, the miracle they had needed, but it came wrapped in questions that grew more urgent with every passing measure. Who was Frank Morrison? Where had he acquired such extraordinary skill? Why was someone capable of this level of artistry wandering into concert halls dressed like a homeless man? And why, when the orchestra desperately needed a pianist, had he appeared at exactly the right moment, like some sort of musical guardian angel. Frank brought the movement to its soaring conclusion, the final chords ringing through the hall with such power that several people found themselves holding their breath, afraid to break the spell with applause or comment. In the silence that followed, the shabby old man at the piano transformed back into himself, shoulders slightly rounded, blue eyes bright with the particular exhaustion that comes after giving everything to the music. "My God," Sarah Mitchell whispered, her voice barely audible. "My God, where did you learn to play like that?" Frank turned on the bench to face them, his expression calm despite the magnitude of what he had just revealed. "Different places," he said quietly. "Over the years." "That's not an answer," Thomas Rodriguez protested, but his voice lacked the mocking tone of earlier challenges. "People don't just develop that level of skill over the years without serious training, without teachers, without—" He trailed off, suddenly aware that he was demanding explanations for a gift they desperately needed. But the questions hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore despite their good fortune in finding someone who could save their performance. Eleanor approached the piano slowly, her heels clicking against the floor with measured precision. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to getting answers to difficult questions. "Frank, I'm going to be direct with you. What you just played requires decades of professional training and practice. It requires the kind of education that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars and opens doors to careers at the world's finest concert halls. Yet you dress like someone living on Social Security and claim to have a small apartment on the Upper West Side." She paused, studying his face for any sign of deception or discomfort. "I need to know who you really are before I risk the reputation of this orchestra on your performance." Frank met her gaze directly, his blue eyes steady and unblinking. "I'm someone who can play the piano," he said simply. "Tonight, that's all that should matter." "But it's not all that matters," David Chen interjected, his frustration evident in every word. "We have contracts, insurance policies, professional standards. We can't just put a complete unknown on stage without knowing their background, their credentials, their name in the program." Frank interrupted gently. "Freak, is that what you're worried about?" The question hit its mark with uncomfortable precision. Several musicians looked away, suddenly aware that their concerns about professional propriety might mask something less admirable: the fear of being associated with someone whose appearance didn't match their expectations of artistic excellence. Jennifer Walsh set down her cello and walked to the piano, her movements deliberate and thoughtful. "Frank," she said, her voice softer than the others, "we're not trying to be cruel, but you have to understand how unusual this situation is. Musicians like you, and I mean musicians with your obvious gifts, they don't just appear out of nowhere. They have histories, teachers, performance records, reputations." Frank's smile was gentle, but tinged with something that might have been sadness. "Maybe they do," he said. "And maybe some of them choose to disappear from those histories when the cost of maintaining a reputation becomes too high." The cryptic response only deepened the mystery surrounding him, but it also revealed something else, a pain that lay beneath his calm exterior, a story that involved loss and choice and the complex relationship between public success and private peace. Eleanor Pemberton was a woman who had built her fortune by reading between the lines, by understanding what people didn't say as much as what they did. In Frank Morrison's careful non-answers, she heard the echo of someone who had once been very much in the public eye and had chosen, for reasons known only to himself, to step away from that life. "You were famous once," she said, and it wasn't a question. Frank's hands rested motionless on the piano keys, but his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Fame is a complicated thing," he said finally. "See you, sometimes it's a gift, sometimes it's a prison, And sometimes, it's just a mistake you spend years trying to correct. The admission hung between them like a bridge half-built, offering tantalizing glimpses of a story that none of them could yet fully comprehend. But even as curiosity burned in their minds, the practical demands of their situation reasserted themselves. "We have less than 2 hours until curtain," Sarah reminded everyone, her voice cutting through the contemplative silence. "Whatever Frank's story is, whatever brought him here, we need to make a decision. Can we put him on stage tonight? Or do we cancel the performance?" The question forced them to confront the impossible choice they faced. On one side lay professional caution, the safe path of canceling rather than risking unknown consequences. On the other side stood a shabby old man who had just demonstrated the ability to play one of classical music's greatest challenges with the skill and sensitivity of a master artist. Frank Morrison sat quietly at the piano, neither pressing his case nor defending his qualifications. He had offered his gift freely, had demonstrated his ability clearly, and now waited with infinite patience for their decision. In his stillness, there was a dignity that transcended his worn clothes and mysterious past. Around the hall, 90 professional musicians faced a moment that would define not just their evening, but their understanding of what it meant to trust in the power of music itself. The clock ticked steadily toward performance time, indifferent to their doubts and fears, carrying them all toward a decision that could not be delayed much longer. Outside, the first early patrons were beginning to arrive, their voices carrying faintly through the windows as they discussed their anticipation of the evening's performance. Inside, the New York Philharmonic prepared to make a leap of faith that would test everything they thought they knew about music, reputation, and the unexpected forms that redemption sometimes takes. The decision, when it finally came, arrived not through lengthy debate or democratic vote, but through the simple recognition of necessity colliding with undeniable talent. Eleanor Pemberton stood before the assembled musicians, her usually composed expression showing signs of the internal battle between pragmatism and hope that had consumed the last several minutes. "We're going to do it," she announced, her voice cutting through the murmur of ongoing discussions. "Frank Morrison will perform the Rachmaninoff with the orchestra tonight." The reaction was immediate and explosive. David Chen leaped to his feet, his face flushed with indignation. "This is insane. We know nothing about this man except that he can play piano. What about insurance? What about contracts? What about professional standards? What about the alternative?" Eleanor shot back, her patience finally showing cracks. "We cancel, disappoint a sold-out house, refund thousands of dollars, and read about our failure in tomorrow's Times. Or we trust our ears, which just heard someone play Rachmaninoff better than half the pianists on the international circuit." Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, her clipboard clutched against her chest like armor. "Mrs. Pemberton, I understand the pressure we're under, but there are practical considerations: stage clothes, rehearsal time, coordination with the lighting crew." "Then handle them," Eleanor replied curtly. "We have 90 minutes to make this work. That means everyone does whatever needs to be done to ensure success rather than listing reasons why it might fail." Frank Morrison remained seated at the piano throughout this exchange, his weathered hands folded in his lap, his blue eyes moving from speaker to speaker with the detached interest of someone watching a play unfold. When the arguments finally subsided and all eyes turned to him, he spoke with quiet dignity. "I should probably mention," he said, "that I don't own formal concert attire." The admission sparked fresh concerns about appearance and propriety. But Jennifer Walsh surprised everyone by laughing, a sound of genuine amusement rather than mockery. "You know what?" she said, standing up from her cello section. "My ex-husband left half his wardrobe in my apartment when he moved out. He's about your height and build, Classical musicians, formal wear, tuxedo, white shirt, bow tie, the whole ensemble. Jennifer, that's, David began. That's perfect, Eleanor interrupted. Jennifer, how quickly can you get the clothes here? 20 minutes. Round trip, Jennifer replied. My apartment's 6 blocks away. Frank tilted his head slightly, considering. Dadik, that's very kind of you. But are you certain your ex-husband won't mind his clothes being used for a performance? Jennifer's smile carried an edge of satisfaction. Trust me, Frank. He'll never know. And even if he did, he owes me far more than the loan of a tuxedo. As practical arrangements began to fall into place with surprising efficiency, the atmosphere in the hall underwent a subtle transformation. The desperate panic of the earlier crisis gave way to something more complex, a mixture of nervous excitement and professional curiosity about what the evening might bring. Thomas Rodriguez approached Frank with less hostility than he had shown before, his trumpet case slung over his shoulder. I have to ask, he said, have you ever performed with a full orchestra? The coordination, the tempo changes, the visual cues from the conductor. It's different from solo work. Frank considered the question thoughtfully. Yes, he said finally. I've performed with orchestras before. It's been a while, but I remember the experience well. The careful phrasing, it's been a while, only added to the growing sense that Frank Morrison carried a significant musical history that he was reluctant to fully disclose. But there was something in his tone, a quiet confidence, that suggested his reticence came from knowledge rather than ignorance. Sarah Mitchell had moved into crisis management mode, her earlier skepticism replaced by professional focus on logistics. We'll need to run through the piece at least once before performance, she announced. Not a full rehearsal. We don't have time, but enough to ensure basic coordination. Of course, Frank agreed, though I should warn you that I may interpret some passages differently than Marcus Whitmore would have. Each pianist brings their own understanding to a piece. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. You know Marcus's interpretive style. Frank's expression became unreadable. I've heard him play, he said simply. The non-answer was becoming a pattern, each response revealing just enough to confirm Frank's musical knowledge, while maintaining the mystery of his background. But time was running short for detailed interrogation, and the practical demands of staging a performance were taking precedence over curiosity about their substitute pianist's past. Jennifer Walsh had departed for her apartment at a near run, her cello remaining behind as she raced to solve the wardrobe crisis. Other musicians began the process of mental adjustment from despair to cautious optimism, pulling out their sheet music and discussing tempo markings and balance issues that would need attention during their abbreviated rehearsal. Frank stood up from the piano bench and walked to one of the tall windows overlooking the plaza outside Lincoln Center. The early evening light caught his profile, highlighting the strong bones of his face and the careful way he carried himself. For a moment, watching him silhouette against the New York skyline, several musicians glimpsed the man he might have been in his younger years, someone whose presence would have commanded attention in any concert hall. Frank, Eleanor called softly, joining him at the window. Whatever your reasons for wanting privacy about your past, I want you to know that after tonight, that privacy may be difficult to maintain. Frank nodded slowly. I've considered that, he said. Some risks are worth taking. And what risk are you taking tonight? Frank turned to look at her, his blue eyes reflecting both sadness and hope. The risk of remembering who I used to be, and maybe, if I am very fortunate, the risk of discovering who I might become. The cryptic response left Eleanor with more questions than answers, but before she could pursue the matter further, Jennifer Walsh burst through the hall doors carrying a black garment bag and a triumphant expression. Emergency wardrobe delivery, she announced, slightly breathless from her sprint through Manhattan traffic. One concert tuxedo, barely worn, recently dry-cleaned, and guaranteed to make any pianist look like he belongs on the Lincoln Center stage. Frank accepted the garment bag with genuine gratitude, his weathered hands gentle on the expensive fabric. Thank you," he said simply. "This means more than you might realize." "There's a dressing room down the hall," Sarah informed him, "but we'll need you back here in 15 minutes for rehearsal." Frank nodded and walked toward the exit with measured steps, the garment bag draped over his arm like a flag of truce between his mysterious past and the uncertain evening ahead. As the door closed behind him, the hall filled with the sound of musicians tuning instruments and adjusting music stands, preparing for a rehearsal that would determine whether their leap of faith would end in triumph or disaster. Eleanor Pemberton watched the preparations with the calculating gaze of someone who had built a successful career on the ability to assess risk and opportunity. Tonight's performance would either be remembered as a remarkable example of artistic faith rewarded, or as the evening the New York Philharmonic lost its collective mind and trusted its reputation to a complete stranger. But as she listened to the sounds of professional musicians preparing to make music, Eleanor found herself less concerned about reputation than she was curious about revelation. Frank Morrison carried secrets that went deeper than mere musical ability, and tonight's performance might reveal truths that had been hidden for decades. The clock on the wall showed 45 minutes until curtain time. Outside, the plaza filled with elegantly dressed patrons making their way toward an evening they expected to be memorable for all the conventional reasons. Inside, 90 musicians prepared to discover whether the most extraordinary music sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources. Frank Morrison disappeared into the dressing room carrying another man's clothes and the weight of his own closely guarded history. When he emerged, everything would change, not just for the evening's performance, but for everyone who had witnessed the transformation of a shabby stranger into the artist he had apparently always been. When Frank Morrison emerged from the dressing room, the transformation silenced every conversation in the hall. The worn cardigan and mended pants had vanished, replaced by an impeccably fitted black tuxedo that seemed tailored for his lean frame. His silver hair, simply combed with water, now appeared distinguished rather than unkempt. Most striking was his bearing. Gone was the apologetic posture of the dismissed intruder, replaced by the quiet authority of someone accustomed to commanding stages. Jennifer Walsh stared openly. "You look like you belong here." "Because I do," Frank replied, adjusting his cufflinks with practiced ease. Eleanor Pemberton felt a chill of recognition. Something about his profile triggered a memory hovering just beyond recall. She had seen this man before, somewhere in her past. "Places. Everyone," Sarah Mitchell called. 30 minutes for rehearsal. Frank approached the piano with growing confidence. When he sat down and looked toward Sarah with quiet readiness, she raised her baton. "We'll run through the first movement." What happened next would be remembered by every musician present for the rest of their careers. Frank's opening notes erupted with such power that several orchestra members sat back in startlement. This wasn't just technical skill. This was the unmistakable sound of a master artist in complete command, playing with effortless technique that comes only from decades of professional performance at the highest levels. As the orchestra joined him, something magical occurred. Frank didn't just accompany the ensemble, he led them, his interpretation so compelling that 90 individual musicians found themselves following his artistic vision rather than the conductor's baton. His phrasing was so natural that the entire piece began to coalesce around his playing. David Chen, playing the violin solos that interweave with the piano, found himself responding to musical cues he hadn't expected. Frank's playing engaged his violin lines in conversation, creating the kind of musical dialogue that elevates both instruments. "Magnificent," Thomas Rodriguez murmured. "This is absolutely magnificent." But Eleanor finally made the connection that had been eluding her. Watching him play with such intimate familiarity, she suddenly knew exactly who he was. "Frank Morrison," she whispered. The name meant nothing to younger musicians, but Jennifer Walsh looked up sharply. She had studied piano before switching to cello. "Frank Morrison? You mean—" Frank Morrison. Not some unknown amateur, but one of the most celebrated pianists of his generation 30 years ago. Frank Morrison, whose recordings had been considered definitive by critics worldwide. Frank Morrison, who had mysteriously disappeared from the concert stage at the height of his career, vanishing so completely that many presumed him dead. The realization spread through the orchestra like wildfire as recognition dawned. They weren't being saved by a capable substitute. They were performing with a legend whose interpretations had shaped their understanding of the repertoire. As the first movement reached its conclusion, Tondi Tiet Sans Tien Fidiu, Frank's playing revealed not just technical mastery, but musical maturity that comes only from a lifetime of artistic development. When the final chord faded, no one moved for several seconds. "How did that feel?" Frank asked. Sarah Mitchell lowered her baton slowly, her face cycling through amazement and awe. "That felt like playing with Frank Morrison." Frank's smile was gentle, but tinged with sadness. "Hello, Sarah. It's been a long time." Eleanor approached with measured steps. "The question now is not whether you can perform tonight. The question is why someone of your stature let us treat you like an unwelcome stranger." Frank's blue eyes met hers directly. "Because sometimes we need to remember that music doesn't care about fame or reputation. Sometimes we need to remember that the only thing that matters is whether we can still reach people's hearts." He paused. "And sometimes we need to find out if we still deserve the gift we were given so many years ago." In 25 minutes, the curtain would rise on a performance that would be remembered not just for its excellence, but for the extraordinary circumstances that had made it possible. Frank Morrison had returned not in triumph, but in humility, seeking redemption through service to the music he had abandoned and the colleagues who had carried on without him. Backstage at Lincoln Center buzzed with unprecedented energy. Word of Frank Morrison's identity had spread through the building like electricity, reaching staff who remembered his name from classical music's golden age. The shabby stranger had transformed not just himself, but the entire atmosphere surrounding the evening. Frank stood perfectly still in the wings, breathing deep and controlled. His formal attire fit like a second skin, his bearing carrying the confidence of someone who had faced thousands of audiences. Jennifer Walsh approached quietly. "Frank, I need to ask something. Why did you disappear 30 years ago? You were at the top of the music world. Then suddenly, nothing." Frank was quiet for a long moment. "Have you ever loved something so much it consumed you entirely? Music was everything. My identity, my reason for existing. I lived for applause, reviews, contracts." He paused, watching stage crew adjust lighting. "Then my wife became ill. Cancer. She needed me present, to be a husband, instead of a performer constantly traveling. But I couldn't stop. I kept taking engagements, telling myself just one more tour, one more session." Jennifer felt her throat tighten. "She died while I was performing in Vienna," Frank continued steadily. "The most important person in my life left while I played for strangers who would forget my performance within a week. I realized I had chosen fame over love, career over humanity. I had become a machine that produced music instead of a man who lived it." His hands trembled slightly. "So I stopped. I walked away from everything. Contracts, recordings, the identity I had built. I moved to a small apartment, taught piano to children, and tried to remember what music meant before it became about money and recognition." "But you kept playing," Jennifer observed. "I had to. Music isn't something you can abandon, any more than you can abandon breathing. But I played for different reasons. for healing, for memory of what my wife and I shared when I played in our living room. Eleanor joined them. Frank, critics are in tonight's audience. Word has spread about your return. This will be reviewed, discussed, analyzed. Are you prepared? Frank considered thoughtfully. I came today not seeking attention, but offering service. This orchestra needed help. What happens after tonight? Reviews, recognition, or continued anonymity matters less than the next 90 minutes. David Chen approached. Surely you want to reclaim your place in the music world. You're playing better than ever. Frank's smile was gentle, but firm. I learned something important during my years away. The music doesn't belong to the performer. We belong to the music. Tonight, I'm not making a comeback. I'm simply a musician serving Rachmaninoff's vision. 5 minutes to places, Thomas announced, then studied Frank with admiration. What you've done today, stepping in when we needed you most. It's the most professional thing I've ever witnessed. Music has a way of bringing out the best in all of us, Frank replied. The house lights dimmed. Frank could hear the audience settling, the excited murmur before performances. Sarah appeared beside him, Conductor's score under her arm. Frank, whatever brought you back after all these years, you've reminded us why we became musicians. Frank nodded, focusing on the approaching music. When I walk out there, I won't be thinking about reviews or recognition. I'll be thinking about a piece that has brought joy to millions and the privilege of sharing it with people who chose to spend their evening listening to something beautiful. The orchestra took the stage to warm applause. Sarah walked to the podium with confident strides. Frank remained in the wings, listening to opening measures that would soon call him back to a world he thought he had left forever. But this time, he would enter on different terms, not as Frank Morrison the celebrity, but as a man who had learned that true artistry comes not from pursuing fame, but from serving something greater than oneself. His entrance approached, and with it, the chance to discover whether music still had the power to heal, unite, and transform not just performers, but all who opened their hearts to receive it. The opening measures of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto, No. 220, filled Avery Fisher Hall with dark, brooding beauty that had captivated audiences for over a century. Under Sarah Mitchell's baton, the New York Philharmonic delivered the orchestral exposition with unified intensity that comes when musicians sense they are part of something extraordinary. In the wings, Frank Morrison stood perfectly still, eyes closed, breathing controlled. 30 years of exile had not dulled his understanding of this sacred moment before stepping into the light, when preparation gives way to pure trust in the music itself. The orchestral introduction reached its climax, and Sarah's eyes found Frank. Her slight nod was both invitation and blessing. Frank Morrison walked onto the Lincoln Center stage. The transformation was immediate and electric. The audience leaned forward as they recognized something unexpected unfolding. This was not the celebrated Marcus Whitmore, but something far more intriguing, a figure whose presence carried the weight of musical history. Frank reached the piano and paused, looking out over hundreds of faces illuminated by stage light. Critics whose reviews could launch or destroy careers, patrons whose support kept the Philharmonic alive, but mostly people who had chosen to spend their evening listening to something beautiful. Frank sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed his hands on the keys. The hall fell into perfect silence that precedes moments of artistic truth. Then Frank Morrison began to play, and everything changed. The opening chords erupted from the Steinway with such power that audience members gasped audibly. This was the unmistakable sound of a master artist in complete command. Saint Petit, playing with effortless brilliance that separates good musicians from the truly legendary. As Frank moved through the first movement, His interpretation revealed layers of meaning that most pianists spent decades trying to uncover. The melancholy passages sang with genuine emotion, triumphant sections blazed with authentic joy, and quiet interludes whispered with intimate secrets. This wasn't just someone playing Rachmaninoff. This was someone who spoke its language with native fluency. The orchestra responded like flowers turning toward sunlight. David Chen's violin solos found new depths of expression. Thomas Rodriguez's brass gained power and precision. Jennifer Walsh's cello anchored the ensemble with newfound unity. By the first movement's end, something remarkable had occurred. Polite attention had given way to electric engagement that occurs when people recognize they are witnessing something truly special. Programs rustled less. Even critics stopped taking notes and surrendered to the experience. During the brief pause, Frank's eyes found Jennifer in the cello section. His slight nod encompassed gratitude for her faith. Her answering smile was radiant with joy at witnessing excellence serving beauty. The second movement began with piano alone, and Frank's interpretation of Rachmaninoff's achingly beautiful melody brought tears throughout the auditorium. His touch was so sensitive that music seemed to emerge like breath itself, inevitable, essential, life-giving. Eleanor Pemberton found herself completely caught up in the music. This wasn't just successful substitution. This was a reminder of why she had fallen in love with classical music, back when she believed art could change the world. As the concerto moved into its finale, Frank's playing seemed to transcend the technical and enter the spiritual. His hands moved with such grace that he appeared to be channeling something larger than himself, becoming a conduit for the composer's deepest emotions and most profound insights. The finale built toward its thunderous conclusion, with Frank and orchestra locked in perfect artistic partnership. Every phrase emerged from their shared commitment to serving the music, rather than showcasing individual virtuosity. When the final chord faded, the hall remained quiet for several heartbeats. That magical moment, when great music continues resonating even after the last note. Then the audience exploded into applause that seemed to shake Lincoln Center's foundations. Frank Morrison stood slowly, his face reflecting deep satisfaction from having given everything and finding it was enough. He bowed with simple grace, then gestured toward the orchestra, directing appreciation toward the 90 musicians who had made the magic possible. The ovation continued for nearly 10 minutes, with audience members rising and critics abandoning professional detachment. Frank acknowledged with quiet dignity, "Sauderian Falerino," understanding that he had rediscovered something precious, thought lost forever. As the curtain fell and lights dimmed, Frank walked off the stage for what might be his final time. But this departure carried none of the bitter disappointment that had driven him away 30 years earlier. He left knowing he had rediscovered music's greatest power, not what it could do for the performer, but what it could do for everyone who opened their heart to receive it. In following weeks, reviews would describe the evening as transcendent and miraculous. Recording companies would call with offers. Concert halls would extend invitations. But Frank had already returned to his small apartment, to teaching children beginning their musical journeys, and to quiet satisfaction from serving something beautiful and eternal. The old piano in his apartment welcomed him home with patient faithfulness. As Frank sat to play for an audience of one, the music was gentle, grateful, and completely free from desperate need for approval that had once driven him from everything he loved. Music doesn't care about fame or recognition. It cares only that we approach it with honesty, serve it with humility, and share it with generosity. On this autumn evening, Frank Morrison had remembered what it meant to be not just a pianist, but a musician, someone who serves the eternal language of the human heart. The music played on, as it always had and always would. carrying its gifts to anyone wise enough to listen with an open heart and courageous enough to believe in the transformative power of beauty made manifest through dedicated human hands. What an incredible journey we've shared through Frank Morrison's return to the stage. This story reminds us that true artistry comes not from seeking recognition, but from serving something greater than ourselves. If this tale of redemption moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you witnessed moments when talent emerged from the most unlikely sources? Please consider sharing this story with others who might need a reminder that it's never too late for redemption, and that the most beautiful music often comes from the most humble hearts. Your likes and comments help stories like Frank's reach people who need to hear them most. Until our next journey together, remember, we all have gifts to offer the world, and sometimes the greatest courage is simply showing up when someone needs us most. The music plays on, waiting for us to find the grace to serve it with everything we have.